The most expensive air defense shot in modern history was fired last June. A single Arrow 3 interceptor, $4 million, exiting its silo at Mach 9, hunting a $30,000 Shad 136 drone made of fiberglass, a moped engine, and a Chinese guidance chip, $4 million. Trash, the math does not get better the further down the chain you pull. By the end of the 12-day war, official tallies put Iranian launches at roughly 550 ballistic missiles and more than 1,000 kamikaze drones. The damage filings filed in Israel later topped 9,000. 9,000 separate damage claims on cars, apartments, schools, synagogues, parked buses. That is what an air campaign that was supposed to be surgical actually looked like on the ground. Not precision, saturation. Before we go further, if you want actual tactical context, instead of watching sensationalized headlines fly past you, hit subscribe right now. This channel breaks down how global power actually moves. Now sit with that number. 9,000 damage events from 550 missiles and 1,000 slow drones. Roughly 12 points of destructive contact per projectile. Most of those projectiles cost less than a family sedan. Most of the interceptors they forced out cost more than the building they were protecting. Something has gone fatally wrong with the cost calculus of modern war, and almost no one in a position of authority is willing to say it out loud. Then the second shoe dropped. United States intelligence, in classified assessments reviewed by the New York Times and corroborated by the Institute for the Study of War, put Iran's post-war ballistic missile inventory somewhere between 1,100 and 1,300 missiles remaining. Tehran still retains, depending on which leaked assessment you trust most, somewhere between 55 and 70% of what it owned before Israel hit the launchers. The DIA internal damage assessment went further. The June strike package, 14 GBU 57AB massive ordnance penetrators dropped by 7 B-2 Spirits, plus a Tomahawk barrage from a submarine, did not destroy Iran's nuclear program. It delayed it by months, not years, not decades, months. Read that again. The first combat employment of the 30,000-pound bunker buster in history. The first direct American strike on an Iranian nuclear facility in 20 years. 2 months of delay. So when someone tells you Iran's missile power has been decimated, you are being lied to by a man who has not read the same intelligence you can read if you know where to look. This is the through line for everything that follows. Every claim of dominance, every confident Pentagon readout, every reassurance that the balance of power in the Gulf still rests where it rested in 2003. None of it has survived contact with the targeting pod footage. 12 days, from the 13th of June through the 24th. That is the entire lifespan of what historians are already calling the Iran-Israel War, or the 12-day war, depending on which wire service you prefer. The Israeli opening salvo landed on the 13th. Air Force strikes against IRGC command nodes, nuclear research sites at Natanz, and air defense batteries shielding the Fordo enrichment hall buried under 80 meters of Angers limestone. Tehran answered at midnight with the first true ballistic missile salvo it had ever fired against Israel. Roughly 150 medium, Range-Amad and Khorramshahr class warheads climbed out of the Zagros Mountains and crossed 3 borders into Israeli airspace. 60% were intercepted. That is the official number the IDF released. 40% were not. By the 18th of June, Iranian launches had passed 400 ballistic missiles and 1,000 drones. By the closing days of the conflict, the cumulative count crossed 550 ballistic missiles, 1,000 plus slow-moving Shade series drones, and a smaller wave of cruise missiles fired from mobile launchers in the Alborz foothills. On the 22nd, Operation Midnight Hammer executed. 7 B-2 Spirits from the 509th Bomb Wing at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri flew east, 18 hours of flight time, multiple in-flight refuelings from KC-46 tankers staged along the Great Circle route, refueling tracks the B-2 crews did not train for in 2010 and were doing live under radio silence. Every refueling rendezvous is a hard requirement. A B-2 cannot make this trip on internal fuel. Without the tanker bridge, the strike does not exist. 14 GBU-57 has fell. 2 on each aim point at Natanz, 12 on the Fordo Mountain Complex. A sub-launch salvo of Tomahawks hit Isfahan's technology center simultaneously. The Pentagon said all 3 sites were destroyed. The DIA leaked memo to the press said they were damaged. The Israeli assessment, the one Mossad shared in confidence with the White House, came in somewhere between the two. Iran denies serious damage at all 3. This is the pattern. One side says one number. The next side publishes a different number. Nobody contests the other side's number directly. They just refuse to repeat it. The truth sits in the gap between the readouts. Less than 24 hours after Midnight Hammer, Iran launched its final major salvo. 200 ballistic missiles fired across 3 synchronized waves, the deepest penetration of Israeli airspace in the conflict. They were hunting Nevatim Air Base in the Negev, the forward operating hub for the F-35 Air fleet that had actually executed the opening strikes. Israeli air defense intercepted most. Did not intercept all. Each Arrow 3 interceptor, $4 million. 101 of them fired across the conflict. $404 million in ceiling engagements alone. Arrow 2, the lower tier exo-atmospheric killer, ran $3 million per round. Another layer of cost on top, THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. the American battery that deployed to Israel under emergency activation order. Each interceptor $12.7 to $15 million per the FY 2026 Missile Defense Agency budget request. More than 150 THAAD rounds fired during the war against ballistic targets that would hit population centers. Call it $2 billion low-end SM-3 Block B. The ship launched variant fired from Aegis destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea. Between $9 million and $24 million per missile, depending on the fiscal year lot. Approximately 80 fired. Iran did not pay anything close to that for what was coming inbound. A Shade 136, the Delta wing loitering munition that became the icon of this war, costs roughly $20,000 to $50,000 depending on which Iranian production batch you are pricing. The export variant sold to Russia was originally priced at $193,000 per unit, then dropped to $48,000 under domestic Russian production. Iranian media has not reported actual Iranian production costs, but Western analysts at CSIS and GNSA, working from component teardowns published by Ukrainian intelligence after capturing intact Jiran-2 airframes, put the Iranian domestic figure between $20,000 and $50,000 per airframe. Warhead 50 kilograms. Range officially 2,500 kilometers, practically closer to 1,500 depending on profile and payload. Engine is a Chinese made 4-cylinder motorcycle piston motor from the Mojtaba production line. Wings, fiberglass composite vacuum bagged in workshops that look like boat repair sheds. Guidance, a commercial inertial measurement unit strapped to a GPS receiver. No terminal seeker, no encrypted data link. It flies a pre-programmed route, then dives. It has the radar cross-section of a stork. Roughly 0.01 square meters. T-8 was not designed to see things that small. Arrow 3 was not designed to see things that small. Patriot's PA-3 was not designed to see things that small. The interceptors cost millions and were built for 1,000-kilogram ballistic missiles. The targets were fiberglass tubes with moped engines. The pattern across this conflict, in every frame of intercept footage shot from hilltop cameras in the West Bank and the Galilee and from the gun camera of an F-15 IRAM over Dimona, is the same. $20,000 Shade, $4 million Arrow 3. $20,000 Shade, $3 million Arrow 2. $20,000 Shade, $15 million TH-80. If you fired 5 missiles at Israel and all 5 got intercepted, that means somewhere between 8 and 20 defensive missiles were launched against them. Defense doctrine requires 2 interceptors per incoming target as the baseline kill probability. That is the war's real geometry. Not 5 shots fired and 5 shots received. 5 shots fired and up to 20 spent. Each of those defensive rounds is $4 to $15 million. By the 3rd day of the conflict, Israeli defense planners had already started mandating dual interceptor engagement only against confirmed ballistic threats and allowing single shot engagement or no shoot assessment against drones deemed to be heading toward unpopulated areas. By the 6th day, the calculus flipped. The IDF was reportedly authorizing engagement only on drones predicted to impact residential zones. Anything heading for an empty field or stretch of highway was allowed to land. This is not an Israeli Air Force that lost its nerve. This is a defense industrial base that ran out of missiles at the rate the Iranian production line was running. Industry response. Lockheed Martin announced accelerated production and a new cheapened variant of the PACE-3 MSE. The Israeli Ministry of Defense Co. funded a parallel Arrow 3 line expansion. The first delivery from the new line is not expected before mid-2027. You cannot rebuild an interceptor stockpile in 12 months. You cannot rebuild it in 24. The lead time on a THI'd round from raw forging delivered canister is roughly 30 months. Arrow 3, 18 to 20, 4 months minimum. PAX-3 MSE, 22 months. So the next war does not start from a full magazine. It starts from a magazine that already has holes in it. It gets worse because nobody talks about the second tier of cost, the deep magazine. Tomahawk cruise missiles, the workhorse precision strike weapon, the Block V production line at Raytheon's Tucson facility, and a second line at the Naval Air Station Patuxent River Integration Facility can sustain roughly 324 missiles per year across both lines. According to Brookings' analysis of the conflict, the United States burned an estimated 1,000 Tomahawks during the Strait of Hormuz campaign that followed the Iran war proper. That is more than 3 years of American production. 3 years. Gone. In roughly 8 weeks of operations. That is not a stockpile. That is a withdrawal from inventory. And the strategic consequence of that withdrawal does not show up in any single news cycle. It shows up 18 months from now when the 7th Fleet has to answer a crisis in the Western Pacific and discovers that the deck load it depends on for forward strikes against a hardened Chinese island defense network is already 2 years behind the production curve. The same depletion arc exists for SM-3. CSS documented that the Missile Defense Agency expects 39 new SM-3 deliveries in calendar year 2025 and 66 in 2026. The industrial base cannot refill the wartime expenditure rate for years. The United States Navy has roughly 280 deployable hulls. The Pentagon's own classification counts them. The same fleet has to cover the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Caribbean, the Western Pacific, the North Atlantic, the Arctic. Each hull in the Hormuz campaign was time borrowed from somewhere else. The implicit tax shows up as deferred maintenance, deferred detachments, deferred refits, Eventually, deferred readiness. Every single one of those 1,000 plus Iranian projectiles came out of an underground production and storage complex that looks, on commercial satellite imagery, like suburban sprawl hugging the slopes of the Alborz and Zagros ranges. Tunnels. Hardened chambers. Tunnels branching into hardened chambers. Distances between production buildings measured in tens of kilometers. Off-ramps designed to handle the turning radius of a transporter, erector, launcher. You cannot crater that complex with cruise missiles. The total tunnel length Iran has published publicly in the March 2025 walkthroughs of senior IRG Space Force commanders through what state media called the latest underground missile city, exceeded the published length of any equivalent facility stateside by an order of magnitude. This is what the strategic balance actually looks like in physical terms. A single Israeli airstrike attempt to crater a missile site requires roughly 20 bunker busters in a coordinated pattern, plus a Tomahawk preparatory strike, plus fighter escort, plus electronic warfare support, plus tanker bridge, plus airborne early warning, plus rotary, wing combat search and rescue on standby. All to put a single crater into a target that can be reopened and restocked inside 30 days by an indigenous production line that does not need any component it cannot manufacture itself. Compare that to what Iran spent to put a single ballistic missile on Tel Aviv. One emitter, one rail mobile launcher, one tail crew of 5, a pre-surveyed launch point in the Zagros that has 3 identical alternates within a 40-kilometer arc. The missile was made months prior, stored underground in a climate-controlled canister, fueled the day of launch, and fired in the dark. The Israeli strike package that hits back at that launcher costs more than the entire Iranian chain that put the enemy missile in the air. That is the war in arithmetic. It is not a sustainable war. And yet Iran is not winning on the battlefield. It is winning on the balance sheet. Here is the brilliance of the Iranian strategy that nobody wants to say out loud. Tehran never tried to win the 12-day war militarily. That was never the operational objective. The operational objective was to deplete Israeli Arrow and American THAAD inventory at a ratio that the producing nations cannot match. Every $20,000 Shade 136 that pulled a $4 million Arrow 3 out of a silo was, by Iranian strategic logic, a win for the war that comes after this one. Not this one, the next one. Iran's design theory of victory is multi-war. Each individual round of conflict is not meant to produce a decisive outcome. Each round is meant to wear down a specific adversary's specific consumable, so that by the time the war that matters arrives, that consumable is gone. This is doctrine, written down in Farsi language IRGC doctrinal publications that have been translated and analyzed by the Washington Institute, RAND, and the Middle East Institute. They use the term strategic exhaustion theory in almost those exact words. They publish equations relating to acceptable cost per intercept ratios. They cite the Second World War Pacific submarine campaign as the canonical example of how a smaller force can destroy a larger one through material arithmetic alone. They are not stupid. They have studied the Yom Kippur War. When Egyptian and Syrian forces did severe damage to the Israeli Air Force in the opening days and forced a peace favorable to Cairo through the demonstrated willingness to keep absorbing losses faster than Israel could replace them. They studied the Hezbollah War of 2006, where 4,000 rockets fired over 34 days exhausted Israeli first-tier air defense sufficiently to force a northern front withdrawal. The people making Iranian targeting decisions right now are middle-aged officers who personally fought the 2006 campaign with Hezbollah observers embedded in their operational planning cells. The brilliant part of the Iranian strategy is that it is internally consistent at every level of analysis. Diplomatically, it forces any adversary to either accept a slow bleed attrition or escalate to a destructive level that breaks international political consensus. Economically, it forces the adversary to spend an order of magnitude more per engagement than the attacker spends. Strategically, it buys time for hardening, dispersion, and reconstitution of the underground complex. Tactically, it accepts 70% interceptor efficiency as a perfectly acceptable outcome because it does not need every missile to land. The single devastating variable they failed to account for was none of the operations of the war itself. It was the Israeli-American decision to target the underground missile cities directly during the closing days of the conflict. Israel shifted from a launch area suppression campaign, hitting mobile launchers as they prepared to fire, to a campaign of destruction against fixed infrastructure deep inside Iranian territory. The cost per Israeli sortie to crater an underground chamber is several hundred times the cost per Iranian sortie to fire a missile from one. Iran built those underground cities assuming the adversary would not pay the cost to destroy them. They were wrong. The adversary did pay that cost. The cities are damaged. Some chambers are collapsed. Some production equipment is buried. But the logic of the architecture of the multi-kilometer tunnel networks, the redundant ramps, the dispersed storage, has not been undone by anything short of nuclear earth penetration weapons, which neither Israel nor the United States has committed to deploying. Iran recovered enough of its pre-war missile inventory to credibly threaten a new round. The United States and Israel have not recovered enough interceptor inventory to credibly repel it. That is the balance sheet of this war, written in inventory, not in victory. Then look at the underground picture. The strike on the Fordo fuel enrichment plant was the most expensive conventional weapons employment in American military history by a wide margin. Each GBU-57A BMOP weighs roughly 13,600 kilograms. The warhead is a deep, penetration design rated to drive through 60 meters of hardened earth before detonating. The fuse is programmable. The airframe is laser, guided with an inertial backup, and a satellite, aided correction layer for GPS, denied environments. The blast yield is calculated to collapse hardened chambers through earth, shock coupling rather than direct fragmentation. The cost of the B-2 that carries 2 of them is approximately $2 billion per airframe. The cost of the 7 aircraft strike package, plus tanker support, plus escort, plus the E-7 Wedgetail airborne early warning aircraft that was almost certainly part of the formation, plus the submarine-launched Tomahawk volley on Isfahan, is estimated by independent defense analysts at between $1.3 billion and $1.5 billion. One single strike package, worse than the entire annual defense budget of most of Iran's Middle Eastern neighbors. Damage assessment. Within 72 hours of the strike, a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment leaked to the press and confirmed by NBC News inside the same week concluded that the nuclear program had been set back only a few months at most. 2 of the 3 sites had been damaged. None had been destroyed. The Fordo facility, the deepest target, the one under the 80 meters of rock that the entire strike package was architecturally optimized to defeat, came out with its centrifuge cascade substantially intact. There is no public explanation from the United States government of what happened to the 12 bunker busters that hit Fordo. They were either too shallow to reach the cascades, or they reached the cascades and the cascades survived the earth shock, or the cascades were not in the chamber at the time of impact. That is a $1.3 billion question no one in authority will answer head on. The official said the program was set back years, the intelligence said months. Both cannot be true at the same time. The truth probably sits closer to the intelligence assessment, because intelligence assessments are written for the eyes of operators who will have to fight the next engagement. Official statements are written for the eyes of voters who will have to decide the next election. If Fordo is operable and the cascade is intact, then Iran retains a working enrichment platform that the combination of the most expensive single weapons package ever deployed plus the most advanced long-range strike aircraft ever built could not eliminate. That is a serious fact, and it changes what the next round of negotiation comes down to. Now drop the camera 3,000 kilometers to the south, to the Strait of Hormuz. 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 200 miles long, 2 unidirectional shipping lanes, roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day, 20% of the global seaborne oil trade, 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade, a choke point that the entire modern energy market depends on. During the 12-day war, Iran did not close the strait. Iran did not need to close the strait. Iran needed only to make war risk insurance go up. Before the conflict, war risk premiums for tankers transiting Hormuz were roughly 0.125% of hull value per transit, less than $10,000 per transit for a typical very large crude carrier. By early March 2026, premiums stood at 0.2 to 0.4%, and war risk rates had risen by 4 to 6 times over a single week. For very large crude carriers, the per-transit increase ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That is what happens to global energy logistics when a naval power cannot credibly guarantee safe transit. Not a blockade in the formal sense. The strait stays open. Tankers keep moving. But the insurance math stops making economic sense for shippers without sovereign guarantee, and shippers without sovereign guarantee are most of the tanker fleet. They reroute. They slow down. They wait. The naval and economic consequences cascaded immediately. Brent crude crossed $100 per barrel on March 8 for the first time in 4 years. By mid-March, it had hit 126. That represented the largest monthly increase in oil prices in the history of the global benchmark. Helium supply contracted. Helium, the second most common industrial input after nitrogen in semiconductor fabrication, depends on a handful of processing plants in the Gulf that ship through the strait. Fertilizer supply contracted. Aluminum supply contracted. Each one of those contracts hits a different industrial end market. Semiconductor fabrication lines, agricultural yield, aerospace primary material production. By late spring 2026, the United States Development Finance Corporation was putting together a $20 billion maritime reinsurance plan to keep tankers moving. That $20 billion is itself a measure of how badly the market signal has been broken. Governments do not write $20 billion reinsurance facilities unless the private market has already priced itself out of coverage. The United States Navy was deployed to the Gulf on a posture the Pentagon internally described as defensive containment. Fighter jets from carrier-based air wings flew defensive sorties over the strait. Mine countermeasures vessels sailed into Iranian mine, laying corridors to clear naval mines placed during the war's final week. U.S. destroyers intercepted Iranian drone boats attempting to harass commercial traffic. Each of those intercepts cost more than the Iranian drone boat it was intercepting. The USS Nimitz, the lead carrier of Carrier Strike Group 11, had been in Panama Bay at the end of March. 3,000 nautical miles from the strait. By mid-April, it had transited west and entered the Fifth Fleet area of operations, but it was operating under rules of engagement that Pentagon planners privately admitted were more restrictive than any carrier had operated under since the early 1990s. The carrier could launch defensive sorties but could not initiate offensive strikes without explicit authorization from Washington. Authorization that in a fluid operational environment would arrive too late to be tactically relevant. By the spring of 2026, the Brookings Institution was openly describing the current American posture in the Gulf as fundamentally contradictory. The U.S. guarantees freedom of navigation in theory. In practice, the guarantee cannot be unilaterally enforced with the current 280-ship fleet. If the fleet is fully committed to the Gulf, the rest of the ocean goes uncovered. If the fleet is distributed, the Gulf guarantee is symbolic. Now look at the second front nobody in Washington is talking about. The political front inside the Arab states hosting the forward infrastructure of American and allied power. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. Each one is watching this conflict and doing its own internal arithmetic about hosting foreign military assets on its soil. Jordan has been the quiet anchor of American air defense posture on the eastern flank since the early 2000s. Forward operating locations, radar sites, logistics hubs. The political cost of hosting those assets in a country where the population is majority Palestinian and the dominant street-level political sentiment has shifted hard over the last 2 years is rising visibly. Senior political, religious, military, and commercial opposition to continued foreign basing is reportedly coalescing around the demand that the United States withdraw air defense battalions from Jordanian territory by mid-2026. Saudi Arabia is watching its own calculus shift. The Saudi decision to pursue a strategic rapprochement with Iran, brokered under Chinese mediation in March 2023, has not held at the public posture level. Privately, Saudi officials have reportedly told American counterparts that continued hosting of American air assets on Saudi territory is no longer politically defensible if those assets are being used in operations that the Saudi government cannot publicly defend in front of its own citizenry. Iraq is the third pressure point. Iran-aligned popular mobilization forces have been integrated into the Iraqi state security architecture over the last 7 years. Strikes against PMF formations inside Iraq, conducted during the 12-day war by American and Saudi elements operating from joint coordination cells in the Gulf, killed roughly 20 PMF fighters and reportedly killed 4 or 5 members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps who had been embedded as advisors. There is no public Iraqi government statement on those deaths. There is no public American statement that they happened. But for Tehran, those strikes register as direct attacks on state-aligned personnel inside a sovereign third country. They are the kind of strike that generates a response requirement under the Iranian doctrine of reciprocity strikes. And there is no public evidence that the response has happened yet. That is the signal worth watching. Let me show you the ledger that ties this together. One single Iranian salvo sized to what a future round of conflict will look like. Iran launches 30 Shade 136 drones. Combined cost under $1.5 million. Iran launches 10 Khorramshahr class ballistic missiles. Combined cost under $50 million. Total Iranian expenditure under $52 million. The defensive response. Arrow 3 engagements 10 at $4 million each, $40 million. THAD 5 at $12.7 million each, $63.5 million. Arrow 2010 at $3 million each, $30 million. SM-3 ship launch 5 at $24 million each, $120 million. Patriot Pate 30, 25 at $4 million each, $100 million. Combined defensive spend on the same salvo in excess of $350 million. The cost ratio is 7 or 8 to 1. Defensively, across the conflict as a whole, that ratio held within a band. Sometimes it hit 12 to 1, sometimes 6 to 1, never crossed parity. If Iran's remaining ballistic missile inventory sits between 1,100 and 1,300, you can do the projection. If half of those are committed in a future round, that is 500 to 650 medium to intermediate range ballistic missiles, each pulling a defensive expenditure multiple. The defensive bill to repel that future round exceeds $200 billion under current cost structure, conservatively. Iran does not have to spend $200 billion to break the defense. Iran has to spend $50 billion. That is the only strategic complication that matters. These costs do not disappear with the ceasefire. They compound, they accrue against the same budget baseline that no major defense ministry is going to grow by an order of magnitude to absorb. Congress is not going to authorize a 500% increase in missile procurement. The Knesset is not going to authorize a 1,000% increase in aero production. The British Parliament is not going to authorize a recapitalization of the Royal Navy surface fleet to the levels the new threat environment would demand. So the structural reality is this. Iran can keep producing. It can keep launching. It can keep losing interceptors per launch at a ratio that the producing nations cannot match. And any future round of conflict resumes from a stockpile position worse for the defense than the previous round. You do not have to call this a victory for Iran. You just have to call it a series of attritional outcomes that the Iranian production line is structurally designed to produce. Where does this end? It does not end with a peace treaty. There is no diplomatic convergence on the table. Iran demands withdrawal of foreign forces from southern Lebanon, lifting of the sanctions regime, release of frozen Iranian assets held in escrow accounts in Seoul, Tokyo, and the UAE. The United States demands verifiable limits on uranium enrichment, cessation of advanced centrifuge deployment, full IAEA access to undeclared sites. These positions are not compatible on a short negotiating timeline. They are not compatible on a medium one either. The political risk of accepting Iran's terms inside either Washington or Jerusalem is by definition an undertaking to pay a domestic cost that neither leadership is currently willing to pay. What ends the conflict is exhaustion, not military exhaustion, economic exhaustion. The moment when continuing the war costs more than any government can politically absorb at home. That moment is not 2 years away. It may be 18 months. The Israeli production capacity for Arrow 3 expands mid-2027. The PEX-3 MSE capacity expansion is already absorbing pressure. The SM-3 block go line at Raytheon is on schedule. But Iran is also producing. The IRGC Aerospace Force self-sufficiency model is a public works employment project designed to deliver political durability through economic dilution of the threat. It is not going to stop. It is not going to be sanctioned into stopping. The sanctions regime, as of 2026, has not stopped a single Iranian underground tunnel from being drilled. The center of strategic competition has shifted. 40 years ago it was the Fulda Gap, then the Persian Gulf Tanker War, then the Taiwan Strait, then the Pacific. The bandwidth of conflict has migrated. It now sits across the narrow water from Muscat to Bandar Abbas, the land bridge from Tehran to the Mediterranean, the underground industrial complex in the Zagros. Iran entered 2025 with roughly 2,000 ballistic missiles, plus an underground production infrastructure designed to restock that inventory continuously. Iran exited 2025 with 1,100 to 1,300 surviving ballistic missiles, an underground infrastructure damaged but not destroyed, an indigenous production line that does not depend on imported components, a demonstrated capacity to fire in coordinated multi-wave saturation salvos, and a multi-layered drone production base. Iran did not win the 12-day war. Iran did not lose the 12-day war. Iran kept its options open. The United States entered 2025 with a forward interceptor inventory designed for a scattering of regional contingencies. The United States exited 2025 with a 1,000 Tomahawk shortfall against a 3-year production baseline, a partially depleted TH and inventory not backfillable until April 2027, an SM-3 inventory already below pre-war authorized levels, a carrier fleet operating under rules of engagement more restrictive than at any point since the fall of the Soviet Union, and a Gulf naval posture that no senior officer will publicly describe as sufficient. The United States won the 12-day war. The United States also cannot afford to fight an extended 20th-day war. Israel entered 2025 with 3 Arrow layers plus Patriot plus Iron Dome covering a country the size of New Jersey. Israel exited 2025 having fired through roughly 1/3 of its Arrow inventory in 12 days, having suffered direct strikes against forward operating locations, and having begun a multi-year industrial rebuild that will not complete before the next round of conflict becomes possible. That is the scoreboard. The 12-day war is over. The cost ledger is not closed. If this is starting to feel bigger than a single regional conflict, that is because it is, drop a comment below with one word describing how this makes you feel, because your takes help shape what we investigate next. Wars in this century are rarely won by the side with the loudest threats. They are decided slowly and painfully by the side that can keep functioning long after the other side runs out of options. Right now, on every ledger a defense ministry actually uses to measure strategic endurance, one side is running out before the other. The factors that determine which side that is or not dramatic, are not photogenic, do not appear on the front of a cable news chyron. They appear inside spreadsheets. They appear inside production contracts. They appear inside baseline planning assumptions that were written before the war started and have not been updated since. Iran is a country that has built a strategic production line for attrition. The United States and Israel are countries that have built national strategies for dominance. Dominance works the day the first missile flies. Attrition works the day the 100th missile flies. If this breakdown helped you finally understand what is really happening in this rapidly spreading conflict, make sure you are subscribed because this story is nowhere near finished. And when the next major shift happens, you will want to be here to understand exactly what it means. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on the day a $4 billion missile got beaten by a $20,000 drone. Bye for now.